The Hazard Communication Standard, commonly referred to as an employee's right to know, is the primary means by which an employee has the ability to understand the chemicals that he's being asked to work with. Through this particular document, called a Material Safety Data Sheet, he understands the hazards associated with them. Additionally, under this standards, you've got labeling requirements, whether it's an OSHA label that's developed, one from the NFPA, or under the Department of Transportation. These labeling systems also provide valuable hazardous communication to that technician. How chemicals enter our bodies, commonly referred to as routes of exposure. We're going to talk about items such as PEL, TLV, STEL, UEL, LEL. All of these are acronyms that as an aerospace technician, you must understand in order to clean up messes that we make, spills of commodities on floors, specific gravity, air density of a particular material have to be knowledgeable so that we can understand whether they're lighter than air, heavier than water, and what PPE will be required. MSDS sheets, probably one of the greatest tools in the aerospace technician's toolbox. They are provided by the manufacturers of chemicals or people who distribute them throughout the United States or import them from foreign countries. These chemical substances, once they arrive on our sites, these sheets must be consolidated and used. There are currently two formats that these MSDS sheets are presented in. The first one is the OSHA MSDS sheet. This is the one that we're federally bound to that lists 9 mandatory sections or elements on that sheet. The only other issue with the OSHA MSDS sheet is that there's no standard format, which means as long as you've got all 9 sections on there, they can be arranged on that MSDS sheet in any sequence you choose. Just the opposite of that is the ANSI MSDS. Under the ANSI MSDS format, there are 16 sections. This is a voluntary document that was developed by the chemical manufacturers. In recent times, since 9/11, OSHA has determined that the old 9-section MSDS sheet is really not meeting the bill for the emergency responder. And so, as they move forward in today's training world, preparing for, unfortunately, the preponderance of the next attack, they've determined that the best way for the country to go is through the new ANSI format. And as I speak, they're currently in the process of getting everyone to convert over from the 9-section to the 16-section format. The 16-section format, once everyone is converted over, will then become the law of the land. As I said, there is no standard format under the OSHA one. Just the opposite with the ANSI. All 16 sections are arranged in a predetermined order, which makes it much easier for our emergency response personnel to determine corrective actions that they need to take. Now that we've talked a little bit about chemicals, we probably need to discuss how can chemicals hurt us. The answer to how chemicals hurt us are what are called routes of exposure. These chemicals pass into our bodies in 4 different ways. The first one is inhalation. A nice 25-cent word for breathing them. This is the most common way that chemicals enter our body, pass through our lungs into our bloodstreams, and then are circulated throughout all of our organs. The second most common way that we have is through ingestion. This is another one of those nice fancy words for swallowing them or drinking them. If we have unwanted chemical substances out in the workplace, or we set down food or drink in the workplace and someone's working overhead with a WD-40 lubricant. The third most common way that they enter our body is through a process called absorption. And as I look at this, I think of the Bounty commercial, the quicker picker upper. Because in essence, this is what our skin becomes. It absorbs those chemicals through the skin, once again into the bloodstream, where they're going to be circulated through the bloodstreams to all the various parts of our body. The least common way that chemicals enter our body is through a process called injection. Injection, for lack of a better word, is the involuntary introduction of chemicals through the protective barrier we call skin. This can happen by stepping on a nail, cutting yourself on a sharp edge, a scratch, and through these types of injuries, these chemicals then get through the protective barrier into the subcutaneous tissue and are absorbed once again into the bloodstreams and circulated through the body. Having mastered the routes of exposure, probably the next complex thing that we have to learn are what we call the vocabulary of HazCom. Some of the key words that we need to learn are words like carcinogen. A big word, and what I've generally find and I teach is that if you look at the core word in the center of it, it makes it a little easier to understand. As I look at this word, I see the word cancer. Now, I don't know about my target audience, but most of us have experienced at least some degree of cancer in our lives through our other relatives or, unfortunately, in some cases, in our own behalf. When I handle a chemical that says on the label or on the MSDS sheet that it's a carcinogen, I think I fairly well know that I'm handling one of the worst of the worst. I commonly refer to these as bad mammer jammers. The second most common form of chemical that we have to be concerned with is one called a teratogen. This is especially true if you are a female of childbearing age or if you've got daughters or young children that are out in the garage where we store a lot of our chemicals at home. Because chemicals that are known as teratogens, if these ladies come in contact with them during the gestation period, it can cause birth defects inside those children. And as most of us know, with birth defects, this is a lifelong misery that we have to contend with. Usually when you see the word teratogen, 2 sentences later, you'll find the word mutagen stuck in that MSDS sheet. Here's what we need to understand. When we look in the middle of that word mutagen, we see the word mutate. We've all grown up with the Mutant Ninja Turtles. Here are critters that are capable of doing things that no humans can do. So we understand that they've evolved or they've changed in such a way from their normal configuration. This is commonly the way that mutagens work. Mutagens, or teratogens in general, basically attack at the cellular level. As they attack at the cellular level, they pass through the cell wall inside the cell. Then they attack the nucleus of the cell where the chromosomes are stored. And as they attack the chromosomes, what they do is they unzip the chromosome itself into separate chains, and then the chains themselves begin to fall apart. The bonds that hold them together fall apart into individual elements, and they start to free float. As the teratogens themselves start to wear off, they reform the individual strands. They reform the chromosomes, and now the cell goes back into what it considers a natural state. Unfortunately, there is no guarantee that it'll go back in the same exact genetic pattern that it was in the initial cell. Thus, this cell has gone through a mutation. At that point in time, when it reproduces another cell exactly like it is now. So now we've got 2. They reproduce, we've got 4. They reproduce, we've got 8, and so on, until we get these growths of these defective cells that we commonly refer to as tumors. Now, when we hear that term, the ears go straight up and we start to pay close attention because we understand, and we're waiting on the next words out of that doctor's mouth, praying that it's the word benign and not cancerous. So as you can see, chemicals that are teratogens, if you're a female or if you've got a wife that could be exposed to them, pose significant problems to those people. The next category of chemical we want to talk about are called sensitizers. Now once again, if we look at the root word in the center of that, we see the word sensitivity. And most of us know that that's the one thing that all of us are accused of never having enough of. But that's in the world of emotion. How does sensitizer work in the world of chemicals? To understand this, we must understand that sensitizers are chemicals that once you're exposed to them, you may react with them. And then every subsequent exposure, your body reacts more violently than it did the time before. A good example, poison ivy. You come in contact with it, you start to develop a minor case. Some people are allergic to it. Other people can be around this stuff and it doesn't bother them at all. The same is true in the chemical world. Past sensitizers, the next family we are concerned with, are those chemicals that are known as irritants. Irritants are an interesting family of chemicals in the fact that they cause what we call inflammation to occur. Another one of those 25-cent words for fluids to build up in either the cells or the tissue itself, the joints. And once again, as that fluid builds up, it causes us to lose our range of motion in those joints. To overcome these, we take things like Motrin, which is an anti-inflammatory, which in turn pulls those fluids back out and allow us to regain normal motion in those cells and in those joints. The last term that we look at on this slide is that of what we call corrosives. When most people think of corrosives, they think of things like acids and bases. But we need to understand that not all corrosives necessarily are put out in those terms. A corrosive, the best way to understand it in the chemical world, is a commodity that when it comes in contact with living tissue or cells, it immediately kills that cell. That's how they define it. Some of the best examples of this kind of a commodity that I can think of is one like acetone. Acetone, the chemical, is used quite frequently when we're cleaning paintbrushes or we're wiping off a surface to remove any oil or grease prior to painting it or prepping it. What we need to understand is that if you're not wearing proper personal protective equipment and you douse a rag and that acetone gets on your skin, as you finish wiping off and put the rag down, you can look at your hands and they'll be kind of turning a light white. And what you're seeing is the effects of that chemical as it's killed that outer layer of skin. Once again, the skin is our most resilient organ. It has the ability then to shed and bring up the next layer of skin that's underneath to compensate for that. Probably the most devastating terminology that we find on a chemical is the word toxic. Most people understand that, but to understand that word toxic, when you pick up that can and see that word, you need to understand that you're handling something like Jeffrey Dahmer. This is a chemical that is proven to cause death in human beings. And as a result, it is some of the worst of the worst. All of the vocabulary that we've addressed up to now lead to one or two different ends. What we're hoping for as the best outcome are those things that are called acute health effects. An acute health effect is one that occurs right here, right now, today. Remember the itching of the skin, as opposed to a chronic long-term health effect, which is one that affects us in the rest of our life. A good example of that would be emphysema. Emphysema in the lungs to where we're no longer able to breathe or walk very short distances without losing our breath. And ultimately what it is it's a thickening of that pleural lining inside the lungs, which causes us to have a hard time getting oxygen in and out. And then as we see oxygen levels start to drop, and it affects the rest of our anatomical function. There are other things that we initially saw on some of the previous slides, things like threshold limit value. The importance of threshold limit value, or TLV, and permissible exposure limits, PELs, is that we need to understand is that what these standards are is the maximum concentration of these chemicals that we can be exposed to without wearing PPE over an 8-hour period. The difference in these two values is determined by who sets it. The one that is enforceable under federal law are those things called PELs. Just the opposite of that are ones that the ACGIH has developed, the Industrial Hygienists Society, and they call those threshold limit values. Although they both measure individual exposure, the industrial hygienists, or TLVs, are usually a more conservative estimate of how much it takes to affect a person. Just the opposite of that would be when we use a different standard to work to, one that's called an STEL, or a short-term exposure limit. They also were developed by ACGIH, but what they do is they set the criteria down of what concentration we can be exposed to for a period of 15 minutes. At the end of 15 minutes, then we have to be brought out into fresh air for 60 minutes, and then we can be put back in for an additional 15 minutes, pulled back out for an additional 60 minutes. And this process can be accomplished 4 times in an 8-hour workday. Usually when we talk about STELs, the part per million ratio of this chemical is much higher than it is for the TLV or the PEL. Rationale being is that even though it's at a higher concentration, but it's for a shorter duration, but it still ends up being the same total daily dosage that we can be exposed to. As we start to round this out, we need to understand that there are some ceiling values that are set for chemicals, which means that once you reach that particular part per million ratio, you can no longer expose us to them under federal guidelines. Other items like specific gravity, whether or not a commodity is heavier or lighter than water, becomes important in terms of cleanup of spills, in terms of the way it's going to react when it's mixed with water commodities or rain. as it's laying on the ground. But the end-all, catch-all are those things that are known as IDLHs. Any commodity or any chemical that is listed as an IDLH, we need to understand poses an immediate risk to us. Thus the term IDLH, immediately dangerous to life and health. That means that it's not that it may occur down the road, it will occur, and it will occur immediately. As I stated earlier, in addition to understanding the MSDS sheet, there are also labeling systems that have been deployed. The first of the three labeling systems that I want to go into is the NFPA Fire Diamond. The NFPA Fire Diamond is a diamond that was developed in 1974 by the NFPA to protect firefighters. It is widely found on the outside of buildings, above-ground storage tanks, and container systems that are used to transport commodities on ships, aircraft, or via overland routes. The blue section of the MSDS sheet is where we find out about what are called health hazards. The health hazards there are identified in terms of risk by a numbering system, 0 being no hazard or minimal hazard, 4 being a lethal or the most hazardous of the 4. The red section, commonly referred to as the fire hazard section, as we said, is red in color. It also uses the same numbering system. The difference here is that the numbers are predicated off of flash point. 0 being that it will not burn at all, 1 above 200, 2 less than 200, 3 below 100, and 4 obviously below 73. As the flash point drops, the hazard increases because it's much more likely to catch fire and burn. The yellow section of the NFPA Fire Diamond is referred to as the reactivity section. What we are really seeing here is whether or not this commodity, if it comes in contact with water, will it or will it not explode or produce things called toxic inhalation hazards and become unstable. So as a firefighter, when you roll up to fight a fire in this situation, or as a technician going into a building that has been caught on fire, the things we look for in that yellow section are the numbers 0 or 1, because we know if a 0 or a 1 is in that yellow section, then in most cases it is a stable commodity or a stable situation that will not render us a problem if we use water to put out these kinds of fires. If we see a 2, 3, or 4, now we need to become concerned, because the 2s, the 3s, and the 4s tell us that not only will it cause problems, but violent chemical chain reactions can take place, as well as dropping or shocking if these commodities fall off of shelves. And finally, with the number 4 in place, we understand that this can result in a permanent detonation inside the building, setting off a massive explosion that could overcome the entire workforce. So as you can see, the yellow section of this is an extremely important one. The white section of the NFPA Fire Diamond is that section that we use to identify specific hazards. They use abbreviations like OX for oxidizer, ALK for alkalines, CORR for corrosives, and so on. The one that we're most concerned with, though, in this particular thing is the letter W with a line through it, which means we should not be using any water in this building at all. Because once again, we're saying that there are commodities in there that if water comes in contact with them can cause fire, explosion, or the development of what we call toxic inhalation hazards. The very top white section is where we find the proper shipping name for this chemical. What we need to understand here is that that proper shipping name, when entered into the white box at the top, must match exactly the way that it is put on the MSDS sheet for that product. So what we're saying here is if it says bleach, household, clear, when we enter it off the MSDS sheet onto here, it must also say bleach, household, clear. To omit the commas or semicolon, what we're doing is setting ourselves up for a labeling violation under the Labeling Act. The next label we want to look at is called the HEMIS label. The HEMIS label is an OSHA label. As I said earlier, the first label in the country, or the father of the labeling system, was the NFPA Fire Diamond. The HEMIS label was developed by OSHA in response to the problems that the firefighters found once they entered the buildings. In the early days, as they entered the building, chemicals were stored on shelves, but there was no way to identify which ones you could fight with water, which ones would have a problem with water. OSHA, recognizing this hazard, said, we need to correct this. Thus, the HEMIS label was born. The beautiful thing about this system is that once you've identified and understand the numbering systems on the NFPA fire diamond, the same numbering systems and the same coloring codes are used on the HEMIS label. So just like the other one, the blue section will identify our health hazards. The difference in this label, as you can see looking at the screen, is that it has two white boxes in it. The left box, if we find an asterisk or a slash in it, without any other knowledge or without an MSDS sheet, a firefighter knows immediately that exposure to this chemical presents a chronic long-term health effect. So this is a piece of information that is critical to their performance of their duties and to us and our survivability in an emergency situation. The right box of the two in the HEMIS label is where we'll find the standard numbering systems applied. Those numbering systems, as we said earlier, will range from 0 to the most severe being 4. To better understand that numbering system, we can understand that if it's a 0 in it, that there's really no significant degree of injury that will occur by exposing us to that. 1, this is where our irritation comes in. In plain words, we have a minimal type reaction to this chemical. Number 2, it talks about temporary or minor injuries. This would be like forming a rash. As we move into the number 3, of course, now we're getting into major injuries like blistering that may occur. And as those blisters form, if they're broken, then permanent scars will develop, leading us into a commodity with a number 4 in that field. On the HEMIS label, the red section, or as I've referred to it earlier, the flammability section, once again uses the same numbering system from 0 through 4 to describe the severity of the hazard. The difference here, though, is that the number systems themselves are predicated off a flash point. As we can see in this slide, if there's a 0, this is a commodity that will not burn. If it's got a 1 in there, then of course it has to be preheated to over 200 degrees before it forms the vapors that can combine with oxygen and an ignition source and burn. The item number 2, now the flash point is moved between 100 and 200 degrees Fahrenheit, and in plain words, it's becoming more likely to catch fire. Number 3, the flash point has dropped now to 73 to 100, which under most situations, unless it's the middle of winter, makes it a very volatile chemical. Although once we reach 4, the most severe of all flammability hazards, we start to see that it can occur at any flash point temperature less than 73 degrees. This is where those things like starter fluids that contain ether or ether-type components are used to start vehicles in sub-zero weather. The next section we want to look at is that physical hazard section, that yellowish-orange colored section. Just like the other one, it has a single box in it, and inside that box we will find numbers 0 through 4. 0 being no hazard at all or a very minimal hazard, 4 once again being the most hazard or the most severe of hazards. To better understand the numbering systems of physical hazards, we can look at this chart. 0, minimal hazard, normally stable under fire conditions and does not react with water. If you'll remember, I told you with a 0 or a 1 in that box, it tells that firefighter that here is a chemical that if it comes in contact with water as part of that firefighting process, it will not cause a violent explosion or reaction to take place. It was not until we got into the 2s, the 3s, and the 4s that we saw those kinds of reactions. Under the number 2, once again, it can undergo violent chemical changes and become water reactive. Under 3, it's capable of detonating or causing some type of an explosion to take place, even at normal temperatures. At number 4, well, now we're down where the worst of the worst is. Should water come in contact with these, we can definitely expect detonation to occur and explosions to occur, which can also lead then to fragmentation of the buildings and other commodities in the surrounding area. All of these hazards are hazards by which the firefighter has to make his living. What we see here is an explanatory label that's used on larger packages, boxes, or drums. In the bottom left-hand corner, as you can see, this is where the HEMIS label itself is introduced into here. The explanatory label itself simply explains what the numbering systems in the very bottom white box mean on the HEMIS label. The third and final labeling system that we want to look at are those called DOT labels. DOT labels, once again DOT being an acronym for the Department of Transportation, are labels that are placed on chemicals or products that are shipped in commerce. When they're put on packages, they're 4 by 4 inches approximately. And of course, when they grow to 12 by 12 and are placed on the sides of trucks, they're commonly referred to as placards. Placards help people on the road identify the commodities that are being transported. In the event of an accident, they allow that emergency responder to determine and shape a response to that. As we look at the 6 o'clock position in the labels that are depicted here, we find that they are numbered 1 through 9. This corresponds to the 9 different classes of chemicals that pose a risk when transported in commerce by the Secretary of Transportation. In addition to classes, there are also degrees of hazards inside of a class. These are referred to as divisions. These are readily identified by looking at the label and finding the decimal point. The number to the right refers to the division. The number to the left refers to the class. Some classes can have as many as 4 and 5 divisions within it. Good example, Class 1, explosives. A Class 1.1 explosive would be something like C4 or dynamite, where a Class 1.4 would be something like a sparkler. Although they are both explosives, the degree or hazard or risk that they pose are different. This is identifiable by the division when coupled with a class. Label safety checklists. Really what this is it's a list of responsibilities. This is a kind of a reminder of things that we need to think about. It's our responsibility to make sure that every chemical container that we use is properly labeled. If a label is missing, we need to notify our supervisor so that he in turn can get someone out there to either relabel it or remark it to where it becomes legible. If we don't understand information on a label, we need to ask about that chemical before we handle it, not afterwards, because should we drop it or have a problem, now it's too late. It's in the emergency response role. Other responsibilities that are associated under this emergency types procedure would also be where to find first aid on that MSDS sheet. If we do not understand the signs and symptoms of exposure, if we do not understand the proper protective equipment to wear, and we become injured, this is where we'll find out about the fact that we need to know where an eye wash station is, or we need to know where a safety shower is. This procedure and this knowledge should all be part of a pre-task briefing prior to the handling of chemicals to start with, so that we have already done the walkdowns and know where these are at in our facilities in the event that something goes wrong. When it happens, the answer is 911, just like we've been taught at home. As first responder awareness trained individuals, all of us in the workplace that handle chemicals have but 2 basic responsibilities: sound the alarm and get out. If you're exposed in your eyes or on your skin, we just need to understand that when chemicals come in contact, that area needs to be flushed for a minimum of 15 minutes and then report to the nearest aid station for proper medical attention.